This is the story of a man. He was a brilliant billionaire who once commanded the respect of an entire city, now lying motionless in a luxurious hospital room, caught between life and death. She was the only nurse who dared to believe that behind those closed eyes, he was still listening. But when he suddenly woke up, it wasn't just life that returned. A murder plot began to surface. The white lights spilling down the long corridor of Westbridge Private Hospital made everything feel like a detached world. Perfectly cold, Emily Monroe walked slowly, each step brushing against the silence that saturated the place. She had been a nurse here for nearly 2 years, accustomed to the relentless pace of emergencies, witnessing lives saved and lives lost. But today, she carried an unfamiliar sensation. Ever since receiving a summons from Dr. Harris, the head of neurology had been restless. "There's a patient who needs your care," he said, his hand resting on a thick file, his gaze drifting to the window that framed a city shrouded in fog. "Not everyone has the patience for this, but I believe you do." When she glanced at the file's cover, her heart skipped a beat. Logan Carter, a name that once dominated headlines, a business genius, the city's youngest billionaire, the man who built a financial empire in just a few short years, until that fateful rainy night when his car plunged into the dark river and everything stopped. He survived, but only as an unmoving shell. Emily entered the hospital's top-floor room, reserved for special patients. Dark wooden furniture, a chandelier casting soft golden light, the space designed like a luxurious apartment. Yet, at its center, Logan lay motionless, silent, as if he long detached from this world. He was beautiful, almost unreal. High nose, square jaw, skin pale as marble. Part of her wanted to believe he was just asleep. She wiped him down with a warm cloth, a task that seemed mechanical, but for Emily it felt strangely personal. Each time she touched him, a chill ran down her spine, not because his skin was cold, but because it felt as if he knew she was there. "Just my imagination," she told herself, though her hands trembled slightly. Day after day she returned, wiping him down, changing the sheets, talking about grumpy patients, the security guard addicted to black coffee, the neighbor's cat that meowed under her balcony every morning. No one answered, yet oddly she felt heard. One night, rain pattered against the window like the sky's long sighs. Emily set her book down, her hand unconsciously slipping into his, and then she felt something, a faint pressure, barely there, as if his fingers had tightened. She flinched, looked down. His hand remained still. The room was as quiet as ever, as if nothing had happened. "Probably just a muscle reflex," she whispered. But that night, back home, she couldn't sleep. That sensation, the faint, fleeting grip, lingered on her wrist like an echo. 2 days later, as she wiped his forehead with a warm cloth, his eyelids twitched. Just once, then nothing. Emily held her breath. She leaned closer, whispering, "Logan?" No response, but the heart monitor spiked briefly, then steadied. That night, for the first time in months, Emily knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the only one awake in that room. That morning, everything unfolded as usual. The sky was draped in a thin layer of clouds, sunlight filtering through the large window of the hospital room, casting pale streaks across the polished wooden floor. Emily pushed the door open, carrying her familiar tray of tools. The faint scent of mint from the essential oil diffuser lingered in the air, a scent she had come to associate with him. Logan remained there, motionless, locked in an endless sleep with no escape. His face was serene, cloaked in a cold, statue-like beauty. But Emily had grown used to that sight, used to it to the point where, at times, she no longer noticed the silence it carried. She had stopped expecting miracles. She stayed, not out of hope, but because of something deeper, an invisible bond she couldn't name. She began her routine as always, checking the machines, replacing the IV drip, changing the sheets, wiping him down with a warm cloth. Everything moved in a slow, careful rhythm, steeped in respect. She spoke to him as if they lived in a parallel world, one where only the two of them existed, and she was the only voice. Last night, the patient in room 304 screamed all night long. I couldn't sleep, she said with a soft laugh. I bet you were the type who wouldn't stay quiet if something didn't sit right with you. Silence, as always. She leaned down to check his wrist, replacing the bandage to prevent bed sores as usual. Her hand brushed his skin, still warm, still pulsing with life. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze, an unconscious habit. But in that moment, something stirred beneath her fingertips. She froze. A flicker of doubt flashed through her eyes. Her fingers lingered on his hand, waiting to confirm the impossible. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Nothing. Probably just a muscle reflex, she muttered, trying to extinguish the thought that had sparked. She'd been trained not to trust her instincts too much, but something lingered, smoldering within her. All day, Emily couldn't stop thinking about that moment. A movement, an illusion, or a whisper from his subconscious. She returned to the room for her evening shift. Everything was the same. Quiet, hazy under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. She sat by his bed, for the first time in weeks not opening a book or reading aloud. She just sat there, silent. "Logan?" she called softly, like an echo. "If you can hear me, if you're really still here, give me a sign, even a small one." And then, very slowly, very faintly, Logan's finger twitched, curling lightly around hers. Emily couldn't breathe. She sat, frozen in shock. Her heart pounded wildly, blood rushing in her ears. She stared at his hand, still resting as it always did, but she knew with absolute certainty that the sensation wasn't a mistake. She shot to her feet, her pulse thundering like a drum. She looked at him again, then took a deep breath and grasped his hand with both of hers. "You can hear me," she whispered, a statement no longer a question. The next morning she reported it to Dr. Harris. His finger moved, twice, deliberately, she said. The middle-aged doctor furrowed his brow and sighed. "Post-trauma nerve reflexes, you know that, Emily. It happens often." "It wasn't like that," she insisted. "It wasn't a twitch. It was intentional, like a response." He studied her for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I understand you want to believe in miracles, but I'd advise you, don't let emotions override your profession." Emily nodded, but in her heart, certainty had taken root. It wasn't professionalism. It wasn't blind faith. It was intuition. The intuition of someone who had sat beside this motionless man for months, listening to every breath, sensing every subtle shift in his heartbeat. And now, for the first time, she felt it clearly. He was trying to come back, not fully, not immediately, but Logan Carter was no longer just a motionless name in a medical file. He was finding his way back, and she would be the one waiting for him on the other side of that divide. 3 days after that faint hand squeeze, something seemed to shift, not dramatically, but enough for Emily to notice. Logan still lay motionless, yet the air around him felt different. His heartbeats were no longer as perfectly steady as before. His facial muscles twitched faintly now and then, and sometimes, just for a fleeting moment, Emily saw the corner of his mouth tug upward, as if he were trying to say something he couldn't yet form into words. That morning, as she changed his bedsheets and her hand brushed his forehead, something strange happened. His skin felt warmer, not in the usual physiological sense, but in a way that suggested deep within him a tiny flame had been rekindled. Emily sat down, resting her hand on his chest, just near where his heart beat. "Logan," she called softly, "if you can hear me, if you still remember something, hold on to it. Don't let go." She didn't expect a response, but what happened next stole her breath. His brow furrowed slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. But Emily had been here long enough, often enough, to catch even the tiniest change. She rushed out and called the doctor. A series of neurological tests were conducted that afternoon. EEG, reflex checks, pupil responses. "There's a slight increase in frontal lobe activity," Dr. Harris said, flipping through the results quickly. "It's not significant, but it's a positive sign. So he's starting to wake up?" He didn't answer immediately. He glanced at her and exhaled. "We'll keep monitoring." But for Emily, that was enough. She had sensed something stirring within Logan, and this time science didn't contradict her. That evening, she stayed by his side longer than usual. The bedside lamp bathed his face in a warm amber glow, a face once lifeless, now hiding something softer, closer to life. "You know," she said, her voice light as a breeze brushing the curtains, "they say when someone's in a coma, their memories are like shards of a broken mirror. Not gone, just waiting to be pieced back together." She paused, her hand unconsciously tightening around his. "So, if you've still got even one piece, just one, find it, Logan. I'll wait." And then, in that moment, a long breath slipped from his chest. Not the mechanical hiss of the ventilator, a real breath, faint and deeper than any she'd heard from him in over a year. Emily nearly leapt from her chair. She stared at his face, eyes still closed, lips still shut, but his chest, it had moved on its own. "Logan," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you dreaming? Where are you in there?" Silence. But this time it wasn't the endless silence of before. It was a silence of anticipation. That night, Emily didn't leave the room. She pulled her chair close to the bed, holding his hand all night, her eyes never straying from his still face. She didn't dare sleep. She was afraid if she looked away for even a second, he'd slip away. At dawn, as exhaustion nearly pulled her under, a small sound broke the quiet. A faint groan. She snapped her eyes open. Logan's cheek twitched. His eyes remained shut, but his forehead creased noticeably. His hand gripped the blanket, his lips parted slightly. Not speaking, not moving. Dreaming. He was dreaming. Emily's eyes stung with tears. You didn't need to be a doctor, didn't need a degree to understand what this meant. Logan Carter, the man once trapped in a blank white world, was now walking somewhere in the shadows of his own mind, and she would be the light waiting for him at the end of that path. Emily could no longer recall the last time she felt time crawl as slowly as it did these days. Ever since Logan began showing clear responses, the furrowed brow, the unusual breathing, the faint sounds in his dreams, she had been living in a half-awake state, suspended between intuition and hope, but deep down, something still felt off, as if, beneath these signs of recovery, something else lingered, deeper, darker. She didn't dare voice it to anyone. Even Dr. Harris, the person she trusted most, always advised her to focus on patient care, not speculate. But Emily sensed something wasn't right, not just with Logan's body, but with how he ended up in this state. That night, after her shift ended, she didn't go home as usual. Instead, she quietly slipped into the internal records room, where all medical and legal documents related to patients were stored. With her senior staff badge and familiar face, no one questioned her when she said she needed to retrieve some neurological recovery notes. But her target wasn't recovery records. It was the accident report. She'd skimmed it once back when she was first assigned to Logan's care. Merely a glance, since he was still considered an irreversible coma case. This time, though, Emily opened each page with a different gaze. Every word, every timestamp, every sketch of the scene, they took on a suspicious hue. The car lost control at 1:16 a.m., rainy weather, slick roads. Logan was found unconscious in the vehicle, still breathing, no witnesses at the scene. The police concluded he'd fallen asleep or lost focus after a late night of work. The case was closed as a single vehicle accident with no signs of foul play. Emily frowned. She paused at an attached sheet near the back. A technical assessment from the scene investigation team. She hadn't noticed it before. The paper was worn, the print faded, but a small, slanted line at the bottom corner made her breath catch. Evidence of manual interference with the brake line. Clean cut, inconsistent with normal wear. Her vision darkened. The brake line. Cut? Her hands trembled as she flipped back through the file. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this? Why did the final report omit this detail? Why was something so critical, a sign of sabotage, relegated to a quiet appendix? It couldn't have been an accident, she whispered. Because if someone cut the brake line, Logan didn't crash. He was targeted. She closed the file, carefully tucking everything back into place, then left the records room. But her heart could no longer stay calm. Each step she took down the empty corridor echoed like a call from a deep abyss where the truth lurked, cold and unadorned. Back in the hospital room, Emily sat down, her eyes fixed on Logan as he slept. She lightly touched his forehead. They said you lost control, but I don't believe it. I believe someone wanted you gone. Logan didn't respond, of course, but this time his brow creased faintly, as if unconsciously answering her. Emily couldn't tell if it was coincidence or a reaction, but she saw it clearly, a nightmare flickering beneath his closed eyelids. She squeezed his hand gently and leaned in to whisper, "If you remember anything, any small piece, hold on to it. I'll go with you to the end." And right then the heart monitor spiked slightly. 1 beat, 2 beats, then slowed. Emily stared at the readings. It could be random, or maybe Logan Carter had just heard the 3 words she hadn't yet spoken aloud. Someone wants you dead. The records room from last night clung to Emily like an unrelenting rain. That brief line about evidence of manual interference with the brake line refused to fade from her mind. She knew from the moment she read it there was no turning back. She could no longer be just the nurse who wiped a patient's brow and quietly went home. She now carried a piece, a first fragment of a very dark puzzle. The next day she spent hours by Logan's bedside. No reading, no idle chatter. She simply watched him. Every unconscious blink, every long breath, every slight twitch of his hand that no longer seemed random to her. She believed that somewhere inside, Logan was fighting, not just to live, but to remember. "I need to know who did this to you," she whispered, her hand resting lightly on the back of his. "If you can't tell me, I'll find out for you." That night, Emily secretly accessed boss's office computer. She knew it was crossing a line, but lines no longer mattered when Logan's life had once been pushed to the brink. She dug into the internal system, navigating to the financial reports attached to patient files. One irregular transaction immediately caught her eye. Date: 4 days before the accident. Sender: N. Carter. Recipient: Byron Blake, a mechanic with a criminal record for staging traffic accidents. Amount: $500,000 USD. Note: technical consultation. Urgent. Emily felt the blood in her veins turn cold. N. Carter. The surname struck like a dagger through the page. Carter. Logan had only one relative with that name mentioned briefly in his file: Ethan Carter, his half-brother. The only person legally authorized to oversee Logan's condition during his coma. The man who had appeared at the hospital exactly once, then vanished. Emily clenched her fists. She had met Ethan once, in her first month of caring for Logan. The man had entered the room with an elegant bouquet of white flowers, his pale gray eyes devoid of any emotion as they landed on his unconscious brother. "I hope he's not in any pain," he'd said, like a rehearsed line. Then he left less than 5 minutes later, never once looking back. She'd never forgotten that gaze, a look colder than the hospital room itself, a look guilty. Emily printed the transaction records, tucked them into her personal file, and returned to Logan's room. He was still asleep, or rather adrift, among the fragments of memories yet to be pieced together. She sat down, pulled the file from her bag, and opened it in front of him. "You need to see this," she said, almost pleading. "Ethan paid a man with a criminal record 4 days before your car lost its brakes." She didn't expect a response, but then Logan groaned. A tiny sound, almost a breath straining from his chest. To Emily, it was like thunder in the night. You hear me, don't you? She leaned closer, gripping his hand. You know? I see it in you. You know who did this. For the first time, Logan's eyelids twitched sharply, his forehead creased. A rapid beep sounded from the heart monitor. Emily didn't call the doctor. She didn't want to interrupt that moment. Logan, she whispered, her eyes welling up. Don't be afraid. I'm here. Whoever's behind this, I'll find them, and you'll never have to face it alone. Logan's heart raced, then slowed, then steadied. She stayed by his side for a long time, never looking away, and as the light of dawn filtered through the window, Emily knew one thing for certain. The one behind the curtain was no longer safe. Logan Carter was slowly waking up, and this time he wasn't alone. Night fell over the city like a heavy black velvet curtain, laden with unspoken meaning. Logan's hospital room was bathed in soft light, with only the steady beep of the monitor cutting through the stillness, as if it were desperately clinging to the fragile thread between life and darkness. Emily sat by his bedside, the printed documents from the internal system still warm in her hands. She didn't know if she was breaking the law, crossing ethical boundaries, or putting herself in danger, but the moment she saw Ethan Carter's name tied to a payment for a convicted mechanic, she knew. The truth had no way back. Logan wasn't fully awake yet. He opened his eyes for a few minutes each day, blinking reflexively, his lips moving without sound. But every time his gaze met hers, there was something unmistakable in it. As if he knew, even if he couldn't yet speak. She took his hand, squeezing gently. I know you've remembered something, she said, her voice like a passing breeze. And I've found the rest. Logan blinked slowly, once, twice. Then his hand faintly squeezed hers. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She leaned forward, not crying aloud, just resting her forehead lightly against his, a silent promise that needed no words. The next morning, Emily requested Dr. Harris's permission to take Logan to the recovery garden, a place of warm sunlight, green trees, and quiet enough for him to breathe like a living person, not just a patient trapped among cold numbers. She pushed his wheelchair, Logan seated there, his head slightly slumped, eyes not fully alert, but with each turn of the wheels, each brush of the breeze against his cheek, he seemed to draw closer to himself. When they stopped beneath a vibrant red maple, Emily sat facing him and pulled a photo from her pocket, printed from the hospital's security footage archives. The image was blurry but clear enough to recognize Ethan Carter stepping out of Logan's office, exactly 12 minutes after the accident occurred. He said he wasn't there that night, Emily whispered. But the camera says otherwise. Logan didn't move, but his lips trembled. Emily leaned closer, holding her breath. Ethan, Logan rasped, the first sound he'd uttered on his own in nearly a year. Her entire body jolted. She gripped his hand. You remember, don't you? Logan tried to nod. His head barely shifted. But his eyes, they lit up, not just with life, but with awareness. That evening, Emily arranged a video call from the hospital room. The recipient. Ethan Carter, he wants to talk to you, she said through the screen, keeping her voice steady. Ethan appeared with a perfect smile. Oh, look who it is, the brother risen from the dead. His tone dripped with sarcasm, as if this miracle meant nothing to him. Logan stared at him, his lips moved faintly, his eyes locked on the face on the screen. Then, he raised his hand, pointing at him, slowly but deliberately. Ethan gave a faint laugh. What's he doing? Accusing me with a finger? Emily sat beside Logan, unwavering. We found the payment, Ethan. We know about Byron Blake, about your lies, and now he remembers too. Ethan's smile froze. Logan spoke again, his voice hoarse, halting, but clear. I remember. You were there. Ethan didn't respond, but in that moment, the mask slipped. Emily saw fear flicker across his eyes for the first time, a brief moment, but enough to confirm everything. "We've contacted the police," she said calmly. "You should get ready." The screen went black. The room sank back into silence. But this time, it was the silence after a storm. Emily turned to Logan. He was still looking at her. Weak, but fully awake. She took his hand and smiled. No longer just a nurse and her patient. They were two people who had stared betrayal in the face and chosen to walk away from it, together. The meeting took place on a cold evening. Wind swept through the trees outside Carter Estate, a place once a symbol of the family's power, now cloaked in a somber air, as if it too knew the secrets within. Logan sat in the old library, a glass of water in hand, his gaze fixed on the door. Emily stood behind him, silent. They no longer needed many words. Everything that mattered was already clear. Ethan Carter entered right on time, his dark coat brushing the wooden floor like the shadow of a predator. He didn't bring flowers this time, just a thin smile and a gaze as cold as steel. "Logan," he said, as if they were old friends reuniting after a long trip. "Sit," Logan replied. His voice was still hoarse, each word deliberate, but heavy with authority. No longer a patient, this was Logan Carter, returned, with memory and truth in tow. Ethan sat, crossing his arms, smirking faintly. "I take it your memory's improved." Logan didn't answer immediately. He set the glass down and looked straight into the eyes of the man who shared his blood. "I remember you standing at the end of the road, watching me plunge into the darkness, and doing nothing." Ethan scoffed, touching, but human memory tends to embellish what it wants to see. Emily stepped forward, placing the stack of documents on the table. Financial records, proof of payment, security camera stills. Each page fell like a hammer, striking the door of lies. "You paid a convicted felon to stage an accident," she said. "You were in Logan's office that night, and you waited to make sure he wouldn't come back." Ethan stopped, smiling. His face hardened, his hand twitching on his thigh. But his voice remained calm. "You don't have direct evidence." "Enough to reopen the investigation," Emily countered. "And this time the police are listening." Silence draped the room like a thick velvet curtain, heavy with unspoken words. Logan looked at his brother for a long time. "Why?" he asked. "For money? For power?" Ethan gripped the armrests, his jaw tightening. "Because I've been your shadow my whole life." He snapped, his voice shattering like glass. "You were the one Father trusted, the one the world worshipped, the one who lived like a legend. And me? A backup heir? A footnote in the will?" Logan closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't the man who survived an assassination attempt, but the older brother who had missed so much. "You didn't have to hurt me," Logan said, his voice softening. "I would have shared everything if you'd just asked." Ethan let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? I didn't want to share. I wanted you gone." The door behind Ethan swung open. Two police officers stepped in, their flashlights cutting through the dimness and landing on his face. Ethan turned, stunned, then leapt to his feet. "You set me up." "No," Logan said, standing despite his trembling legs. "You set yourself up the moment you chose betrayal." Ethan was handcuffed. As he was led away, his gaze on Logan shifted, not hatred anymore, but emptiness. The emptiness of a man who'd hoped to destroy a soul, only to be consumed by his own darkness in the end. That night, a light rain fell. Logan and Emily stood on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, watching the night as if it had been washed clean. "I didn't think it would end like this," Logan said softly. "Honestly, I thought I'd never feel anything again." Emily turned to him, the outdoor lights reflecting in her teary eyes. "But you came back from a place others can't, and you didn't come back alone." Logan faced her, his hand finding hers. "No," he said, "I came back because of you." They stood there, amid the sound of rain, in the peace reborn from ruins. No more toxic blood ties, no more secrets. Just two people, once alone, now finding each other at the edge of life, death, and something called love, proven not by time, but by resilience. Logan tilted his head, his forehead brushing hers. "I love you, Emily Monroe," he whispered. She closed her eyes, smiling. "I know."